Hello everyone, I'm here to tell you that tickets are now live for the first ever A Pair of Bookends live episode, which will take place on the 22nd of January at Queer Lit in Manchester. I am so excited for this event, and I will be interviewing the wonderful Kate Fagan about their brilliant new novel, The Three Lives of Kate K. And I really hope that you can come and join us. There's loads of exciting things. Queerlit are the best at doing book events, so I really hope you can join us. And if you would like to book a ticket, please do. The link is in the show notes. See you there. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Welcome to our first episode of 2025. January's bonus books episode is dedicated to Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix, a dark, moving and unsettling novel that explores the lives of young girls hidden away in maternity homes and the power that one book on witchcraft brings them. Grady Hendrix is an American author, journalist, public speaker and screenwriter. His books have been translated into 23 languages and have sold more than 2 million copies. Grady is the author of 7 novels, including the New York Times bestseller The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, The Final Girl Support Group, and My Best Friend's Exorcism, which was adapted into a film by Amazon Studios. His novel Horror Store is also being adapted into a movie by the team behind 1917 and Black Swan. He's also written short stories, a novella, and non-fiction, including his History of the Horror paperback boom of the 1970s and 80s, Paperbacks from Hell, which won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Non-Fiction. Here to chat about his latest novel, Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, welcome, Grady, to A Pair of Bookends.
Thanks for having me.
No, I'm so excited to have you, and I can't wait to dive into your book. I already told you before we started recording that it is one of the few books that has nearly made me cry. We will get onto that, but before we start, I have to ask you what you've been reading over the Christmas break.
Yeah, well, so I've been reading a bunch over the Christmas break, but the 3 books that really have stuck with me is Claire Keegan's A Small Thing Like These.
So good.
Small Things Like These. So good and so short, which I'm really jealous of. Yeah, I was like, why can't I write something short that everyone loves? And then I also read my Catalan translator turned me on to this book she loves by Anne Vine. It's a British book written for kids from the 90s called The Tulip Touch, which is really floored me. I think it's still in print, but it was written in response to, it's about two girls, and one's the good girl and one's the evil girl. You know how it always goes, and she loves fire and things. But it was written in response to the Jamie Bulger murder, back in 93. But it wasn't written about the murders. It was written about how everyone talked about them.
Yes.
And so it's very much like, what are we doing saying that a kid is born bad? What does that mean? We make kids bad.
Mm-hmm.
We may and it's one of the few books I've read that really just at the end, I sort of needed a moment of quiet. I felt it's really great. And it delivers on that sort of horror front, but it also is really just beautifully raw and sobering. And then the other book I read finally, which I've been meaning to get to, I don't know, it's been made into a movie a few times, but it's called The Beguiled. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I've not.
It's an American book by a guy, Thomas Quillian, I think, how you pronounce his name, from 1966. Sofia Coppola made it into a movie. It got made into a Clint Eastwood movie. And I put off reading it because it's about a soldier in the Civil War who's found injured by a house full of girls who are at a boarding school for young ladies. And it's the only man in the house, and things go wrong and amputations ensue. And I put off reading it because I was writing Witchcraft, which is about a house full of teenage girls where everything goes poorly. And so I didn't want to steal anything from it. And I'm glad I did, because it's really great. And it's a book with I really admire this with a novel that's horror, where the body count is very low, but it feels harrowing when you get through with it. You just are so invested in everyone.
Yeah. Oh my God, they all sound amazing.
What did you read over the holidays?
Oh my gosh. Well, firstly, I need to say that if you loved Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These,
Yeah.
I am also really eager to get to Foster. And a lot of people have said that they think Foster is even better and more moving than Small Things Like These, which I didn't believe would be possible, but apparently it
Oh,
is.
wow.
So I'm really excited for that. And also, I'm really intrigued by the second one that you mentioned as well. Over the holidays,
Oh,
I read Bellies by Nicola Dinan.
I don't
Um,
know that.
it's a really beautiful book. It's about a relationship, and then one of them, it's a gay relationship, and then one of them kind of struggles with their mental health and then comes to terms with the fact that actually they're trans and want to transition into a woman. And my language is probably really clunky around this, so apologies
Yeah.
for people listening. But it's just a really, really beautiful book on like identity and, coming to terms with your identity, but whilst in a relationship, which I thought was a really interesting kind of look at that dynamic. Really beautiful book. Her prose is wonderful, and it was her debut. So yeah, I was really blown away by that one. And then I read yours over the Christmas break.
Oh, why? What good taste you have.
So yeah, I really enjoyed both of those. But why don't we dive into your book? Because that is
Let's
what
do
you're
it.
here for. I would love to start off by start us off easy by asking what the inspiration behind this book was.
Well, the inspiration behind this book was another book. So when I was in my 20s, I found out that two women in my family had been what they call sent away when they were teenagers. They had both gotten pregnant and were sent to maternity homes, and no one knew about it. One was in I think her 70s when we found out about it. The other, I think, was also in her 70s. And this had just been a secret all their lives. One reunited with her son, the other never saw her daughter again. And it really kind of floored me that these two women I was very close to, that I loved very much, had carried this with them all their lives. And, to have a child and not know alive, dead,
Mm.
sick, well. And I wound up trying to wrap my head around it, reading a book by a woman named Ann Fessler called The Girls Who Went Away, which is an oral history of the Holmes. And it's one of only two or three books that were ever written about the Holmes. And I suddenly realized that these homes were an amazing place to set a story. I mean, they're a bunch of teenage girls who have been isolated in the middle of nowhere. They're told they're never going to talk about this 3-month, 4-month, 5-month period of their life again. And they've been told they've ruined their lives and everything they've done is wrong and it's never going to be fixed.
Hmm.
And they're terrible people. And I was like, and some of the girls in Ann Fessler's book talk about how what a relief it was to be around other girls in their position. They were the only people they could talk to, and none of them knew. No one would tell them, and the homes varied a lot, but no one would tell them what childbirth was going to be like. No one was going to tell them anything. And I just always kind of filed that away as I should write something set there. And then I finally got to a point where I felt like maybe I was good enough to tackle it. And then it took me a really long time to write this book, and it went through 8 enormous drafts, 2 of which didn't even have witches in them. And I realized I wasn't ready to write this book. But I squeaked through.
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you did because I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I don't think enjoyed is the right word for it because, I was incredibly moved by it. And I think I said to you before we started recording that, like, I wasn't expecting it. I don't know what I was expecting going into this book, but I think the cover of it is sort of the traditional kind of horror cover.
Right.
So I just didn't know what to expect. And actually, it's this really moving, profound, kind of heartfelt book about like what so many women have suffered in history, and it's a really harrowing story. And I wanted to ask you about genre because I know that I think it's the New York Times I've got written down here said that your horror novels are a gateway drug to the genre, which is a really cool thing to be said about your work. But I'm curious how you perceive genre and how your book kind of sits into it because I mean, for me, I'm not a massive horror reader, so I'm not sure, but I always thought it would be kind of more fantastical elements to horror. And obviously, you have the witchcraft elements, but a lot of the horrors in this story are horrors of real life, and they don't feel far-fetched at all. So could you talk a bit about genre and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, and first off, thanks for saying everything nice you said about the book. I mean, this is a book I lived with for 2 years in my room, and so it's very weird to have it out in the world with other people reading. I sort of
can
figured,
imagine.
oh, this will never get released. Yeah. So yeah, genre is weird because it really is more a marketing department concern. But I also know that's how people find new books, and that's why I have a career and all that. And so it's interesting. For me, horror is what I write simply because it seemed to be what I was writing when I was starting out that people responded to the most. And what I really realized about horror that I like about it is that I'm pretty limited, imaginatively speaking. So like doing sci-fi where you're going to take an idea and extrapolate it into the future, or you're going to make up another world or another planet. Like I'm not good at that. And fantasy, which is often secondary world fantasy, I've got, these different races and languages and all this sort of in that high fantasy. I'm not good at that. I like horror because, like romance, horror, it very much deals with the here and now, sort of what's around us
Mhm.
and like the world we live in, the people around, how people interact, and then it adds kind of a twist. And to me, it's sort of the pessimistic version, whereas romance is the optimistic version. But even then, I find it limiting in some ways, or I don't find it limiting actually. But I know that some people read my stuff like I don't do unhappy endings. I just feel like life is hard. We're all in this
Mm.
together. I don't want to be the person prying someone's fingers off the lifeboat and saying back into the cold dark sea with you. I kind of feel like you need to keep going in the story till your characters get somewhere better. And I know for some people that doesn't feel like horror to them. They like a bleak ending, which I do too. And with this book, it was really complicated because witches aren't good or bad. Do you know what I mean? Like how you feel about witches largely says something about how you feel about women in power. I mean, are witches old ladies living in candy houses eating children? Or are witches a bunch of naked women dancing in a circle in the woods and worshiping the moon? Like, it depends on what women with power says to you.
Mm.
And so, so I wanted my witches to sort of walk that line. And where I really wound up drawing a lot of the language of how my witches talk and how they feel and what they do was from activist literature from 1970, which was a really big year. I mean, you had the Black Panthers, you had
Yeah.
Witch, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, you had the Weather Underground, you had all these action, you had these bombings and assassinations and protests. And there was this real thought of this is the revolution. The revolution starts now. We are at war with the world, whether we're women or people of color or queers, we're at war with the world. War is on, and we are being warred against, and we will fight back with the weapons of war. And that language really informed how I thought about witches because, as much as I respect, the goals of these
Mm.
progressive liberation movements, you also, within those movements, there were debates. How much violence is okay? Is it okay to kill people? Like, if a bomb goes off and it kills, the janitor at the ROTC office, is that okay? Like, what's the body count that's acceptable? And so that's where I sort of wound up with my witches. So yeah, horror is tricky and it's
Yeah.
slippery and it kind of is what you say it is.
Yeah, I want to dive more into witchcraft and what you were just saying there because I found that so interesting and I personally felt that it belonged in this story and I can imagine my own reasonings for it, but why did you feel that witchcraft belonged specifically in this story with these young girls and what do you think was the initial draw for them?
Well, so it's a matter of debate because my first two drafts of this book had no witches. It had witches in the title, but no witches in it. And my
Oh.
editor was like, yeah, these feel a little, I think it'd be more dynamic if the witches were actually in it rather than just a title. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Um, and so, but I realized as I thought about it that, witches have always been associated with children and childbirth, whether there's sort of the legend of witches stealing children or turning babies into flying ointment or eating children, or the legend, which is equally legendary, that witches were midwives, who were being oppressed. I mean, some were, but it wasn't like a war on midwives. And in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a huge midwifery movement. It was like, let's maybe listen to women who are having babies and lean more into that during labor and delivery rather than telling women how to have babies and then
Yeah.
strapping them down to gurneys and doing it the way we've decided that's going to happen. So
Hmm.
there was that kind of movement. And then there was also this idea of there was a huge glut of occult books in the late 60s, and lots of them were things you pick up at the supermarket, like, moon magic for romance or, how to be a sensuous witch. And I thought, what these girls' problem in the home, maternity home, is they don't have any information. They don't know what's going to happen to them and they don't know what their options are. And it's like, well, books, librarians, that's all about getting people information. And so that was sort of where that started out. And, witchcraft, women or women accused of witchcraft, it's often been women sort of preserving information,
Yeah.
herbal remedies and things like that. I mean, not exclusively, but that's been a part of it. So it all seemed to kind of join up. But unfortunately, it took me two full drafts of the book to realize how it all made sense.
I love that. You alternate each chapter with snippets from this book that they get their hands on from that librarian, and it's called How to Be a Groovy Witch, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that based on a specific book, or is that just something that you imagined?
Well, I stole the title from How to Be a Sensuous Witch, which
With
is
you?
a great
That's what.
paperback that went around. Yeah, but I really stole a lot of the language from this book that was written, I think, in the 60s called The Anarchist Cookbook, which has since been disavowed by the author. But it was this
Oh.
book that was published and just distributed by hand. I had a copy in the 80s. A lot of the young boys did, because it's sort of, here's how you make explosives. Here's how you
Oh.
start a revolutionary cell. Here's the war is coming and you need to be fully armed and know how to, make a pipe bomb. And not a lot of people. The rumor was that many people, of course, tried to do these things and blew
Mhm.
off their fingers and things like that. And the author has since said, I am sorry I ever wrote this book, but it was sort of a revolutionary manual that by the 80s had become this cult object with young boys, especially because, 13-year-old boys all want to go off to war and then they do. And then they
Yeah.
really regret that decision. And so that was really where a lot of the language came. And in fact, some of the passages from Groovy Witch are, I think by now they've sort of mutated some, but they really started as excerpts from the Anarchist Cookbook.
I've never heard of this book, so I'm really fascinated by that.
I think it was a very American phenomena.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask about, you mentioned it briefly earlier, but I want to ask about I mean, your cast is primarily made up of young girls. And I want to know what that experience was like for you, because I think you mentioned before that you were quite nervous about doing that.
Yeah.
But what was that experience like of getting yourself into the mindset of these young girls?
Well, that was sort of one of those things where I started writing the book, and very early on, I was like, oh, this is a book about a bunch of pregnant teenage girls, and I am a childless, middle-aged man. And I've written a lot of young women before, and I keep calling them girls in this book. I do that not to disparage them, but just I always want to remember that everyone talks about unwed mothers and these single mothers, and I don't know, calling them girls helps me remember that these were
They were
children.
so
I mean, these
young,
are
yes.
13 and 14-year
Yeah,
olds who are being asked to have a baby and
yeah.
give it away or have it taken for adoption. And so, anyways, so I've written about young women before, and that's something I sort of gravitate towards. But writing about all these girls when they're pregnant was hard, and
Yeah.
I relied on a coven, you could say, of women who really helped me. There were a lot of moms who were really, really generous with their time and letting me ask stupid questions about their pregnancies and their birth stories and come back to them and ask, follow-up questions. There were several OBs and laborists who they all, one man and a couple of women, three women, who let me come back over and over, like walking me through procedures and an episodic repair and all these things. And so I couldn't have done it without them. Like they really, I mean, I had things like my Williams Obstetrics Manual from 1968 and things like that. But these women giving me the time and letting me ask stupid questions really the book wouldn't have happened without them. I was just going to say, there's this weird idea that the author writes the book, and that's true, and it's your name on the cover, but man, every book is a product of a committee. I don't care if
Yeah.
you're William Faulkner or a dork like me. Like, there's an editor, there's an agent, there's copy editors, and then if you're lucky, there's other people helping you
Yeah.
out along the way.
I mean, it feels really authentic and real, and I know that some women might kind of come to this book and maybe a bit wary about the fact that it's a man writing about all these young girls, but I
Right.
actually
They
think
should.
but I honestly think that you write them so well and it's so believable. And I was really kind of taken aback by the way you explored pregnancy and the way you explored childbirth. And there are some really intense kind of long scenes where you go into
Oh, yeah.
what those experiences are like. And actually I felt they were important in there because we needed to understand that, like you said before, these were just children and what they were being made to go through alone and often being treated in a really horrible way. Is it an intense, awful thing? And when some people give birth, they might feel like it's a really magical experience, but that was not the case for these girls. Why was it important to you to include these scenes?
Yeah, well, there's two things. One is when sort of write books, I try to read a lot of other things in the
Yeah,
genre. Like I wrote a book called Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and a lot of the women in that are full-time moms. And so I read a lot of what I sort of started to think of as housewife novels,
yeah,
about, and a lot of them were really disparaging of, and a lot of them were written by women, but very like, oh, these housewives have these bleak, unfulfilled lives. And I get there's a lot of drudgery
mm,
to taking care of a house and raising children, but it also didn't seem to reflect the experience of women I knew who did that
yeah,
totally. And so I read a lot of pregnancy and childbirth books, and then maybe I missed some of the really good ones, but I read a bunch, and they either seem to be very body horror or they seem to sort of be a little sentimental about childbirth, and that's what I wasn't hearing from the women I was talking to.
mm,
And I feel like there's this urge to rate everything. And I think it's a pre-internet urge. I'm not just trying to say the internet's bad, but thumbs up, thumbs down, would
yeah,
recommend, would not recommend. And I feel like there are experiences in our lives, the death of a loved one, having a really debilitating disease or an accident. And I think childbirth is another, that they aren't good or bad. You can't put them in this bucket. They are experiences and you go
yeah.
through them, and they are bigger than an opinion. And I really wanted to try to capture that sense. And then the other thing I wanted to do, and there's sort of a scene of hospitalized childbirth in 1970, which is, I find the way we delivered babies in 1970 horrifying. Then there's a scene of just these girls having a baby on their own. And I had a lot of fights with my editor about this because I felt like even though we all have this urge to protect children and make sure their lives are comfortable, you go through intense stuff when you're a teenager. I mean, I think everyone can think back on situations where it goes beyond just a funny story or, whoa, I could have died. It goes to a point of, I went through something harrowing and I
Yeah.
survived. And I don't think we give kids enough credit. And I
No.
wanted these girls to go through this major life event and go through it because I think kids are capable. I think I've talked to 14-year-olds and known 14-year-olds who've had things happen to them that I don't think I could survive as an adult. And so I sort of wanted to pay tribute to these kids, just even if it seems insurmountable and
Mm.
impossible, it's never is.
It's a real thing that people have experienced in history. So
Yeah,
it's,
right,
it's important that you kind of shed light on that. And, there's no point in shying away from something that a child would have had to go through. And I
right.
think, Holly was the kind of representation of that. And I'm going to be really careful. I don't want to give any spoilers or anything like that.
Sure.
But I found those parts, particularly enraging because she is so young and there's so much kind of shame that's piled on these young girls,
Yeah.
and there's so much hypocrisy around it, particularly with things like religion and that being used against them. There's so much stuff to kind of feel uncomfortable about the way that they're treated, and I found it quite depressing to think that actually whilst we've moved from the time of the maternity homes and I think it's called the Magdalene Laundries in Ireland, we've
Yeah.
moved away from that. It feels like in parts of the world, there's still kind of a rolling back of the dark times in history when it comes to things like that, as we've seen in America with Roe v. Wade. And yeah, it's I wondered what it was like for you to kind of, when you were writing it, to think about, how things have moved forward, but also how they haven't in certain
Yeah.
places. I've probably worded that terribly, but
No, 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 not at all. I totally get what you're saying. And, for me, it was something I kind of became aware of halfway through the book is the political angle,
yeah,
because I sort of realized, oh, damn it. I'm writing a book that largely centers on reproduction and childbirth. And it's going to come out. It was supposed to come out in August of an election year that was largely going to hinge on reproductive rights. And I was like, this is not a good idea. And then fortunately, I am a terrible writer and I blew my deadline and the book it got pushed to January, which, now we've got Trump coming in as president and a lot of people are worried about more reproductive rights being rolled back in the States. But then you look at places like Ireland, voting to legalize abortion a few years ago, which, I don't think anyone can look at those pictures of those women in the street celebrating and not get emotional.
Yeah.
Because we're also bringing to it, we know how they were treated before this. Mm-hmm. The most shocking thing to me in this book was reading about unwed mothers and how we in the States, and I think it's the same in the UK, but especially in the States, which is what I'm more familiar with, talked about them and treated them as if they'd done something wrong. So many of these women were raped or sexually abused or had no access to birth control or didn't even know birth control was an option. And all the blame was piled on them. And there's actually a line in a book written for ministers from 1964 about how to minister to an unwed mother. And it really was this wake-up call for me because I read a lot of these manuals about, dealing with unwed mothers and how they're this social blight and all these things. And, if you were pregnant and a high school student in America up through the 70s, you were automatically expelled because they didn't want you to contaminate the other girls. And reading this manual, they give the typical scare statistics of this many babies born out of wedlock, this many unwed, blah, blah, blah. And then it says something that I never saw anywhere else. And it says, you will notice there are no statistics about the fathers of unwed babies or of the unwed fathers. There simply are no statistics or numbers. And I thought, Jesus, that's right. In all these books I've been reading, we're talking about these unwed mothers, these illegitimate babies, all that, and they never mention the guys. And that was such a moment for me. And you can read this sort of blame being laid on women all the way up to the present day. I mean, people couch it as single parent homes. Well, which parent are they talking about? Single mothers and single, one parent children and all this stuff, and how, the kids turn to crime or drug use and all these things. Welfare queens is another code word they use. And it's all just about blaming these moms. And the weight of that was really depressing, I'll say. And the thing that sort of was the light in that is, and I think I said this to you earlier, but reading some of the accounts written by these women who were in the homes and talking about how the other girls in their position were there for them and other women were there for them. And there'd sometimes be a social worker or a nurse or someone who reached out to them. And that kind of solidarity, and especially among kids, I mean, so many of us, myself included, only got through high school, only got through even middle school or grade school because we had people around us who had our backs in a way that the adults didn't. And I think that solidarity, which I saw over and over, is the only thing that was the light, because the way we blame these kids is so depressing and we never seem to stop.
I was trying to understand when I read your book, like whilst I was reading it, I was trying to understand like how the men involved in these pregnancies, how they escape the blame. Like I don't understand how that happens, how the shame and the blame is never placed on them. And I couldn't work it out. I was trying throughout the book to be like, well, how have we come to that? It just seems to be like from way back when, being the kind of Eve is not the Eve's curse. Is it the Eve's curse? It's like the
the curse of Eve. Yeah,
the curse of Eve.
In
and it's
pain,
like
in sorrow, you shall bring forth children.
Yeah, it's Eve is the perceived as the bad one, and it's never like, oh, what's Adam's involvement? And let's look at that. It's it's always the blame has always been on women, and I just don't know how you can kind of move away from that. I mean, obviously we are moving away from that now, but yeah, I couldn't get my head around it when I was reading the book. I was like, does nobody care that there were men involved at any point in this?
No, and it's interesting. You read accounts by these women, and often, I mean, people would say, "Oh, you don't want to ruin his future," or he comes from a good family. You don't want to drag his name down. Or the guys would just deny it. Well, you know what I mean? Like, what proof do you have? And one of the things though that's interesting, you bring up like the curse of Eve. There was a really, and I feel like this is one of those things where there's always some light. So in the late 19th century, what was happening was a lot of women were fighting for the right to vote and for more rights. And they noticed that chapter 3 of Genesis, which is where, the serpent tempts Eve and she bites the apple in the Garden of Eden, was always being used to show why women shouldn't have these things. Women are more prone to sin, women are weaker. And so a lot of these women started rewriting the Bible and reinterpreting it and say, wait a minute, what's so wrong with someone giving you knowledge? It was the tree of knowledge Eve ate from, not the tree of life. What's wrong with this? And they started rewriting, and there was actually Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all these famous suffrage workers, women working for suffrage, started rewriting that chapter of the Bible and putting out women's Bibles and talking about like Satan as this liberatory figure in books like Lolly Willows in 1926, which was the huge hit, which is getting reissued soon. It's been forgotten, came out about a woman who just sort of like, I'm bored of life and people treating me this way. I'm going to embrace Satan. And it became known as satanic feminism. But it was this huge brand of sort of feminist thought that said, you say Satan's bad. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so it was this really amazing, and it kind of died out in the 30s, but it was this great movement that was very much like, you say women are bad because we're friends with Satan. Well, we say Satan's awesome. And it's wild to read this. There's a memoir by this girl from 1903 or 1906, Mary McLean, who became very, very famous in the US for like 10 or 15 years and then sort of flared out. But she wrote this memoir. I mean, she had cocktails named after her, brands of cigar. She was huge. And her memoir was called I Await the Devil's Coming. And it was just about growing up as a teenager in a small town. And she hated it so much that she spent all day waiting for Satan to show up and to like take her away from this tedious world that had been built for her.
Oh my God, I've never heard of this book and I really want to read it
I
now.
hadn't either. Yeah.
Oh, is it still in print?
I Await the Devil's Coming. Yeah, it is. And especially Lolly Willows, which is a British book written by a woman named Sylvia Townsend Warner that was huge. And it is really funny and really beautifully written. But it's about this middle-aged woman who doesn't have children. And she's like, I'm invisible to everyone. Okay, I'm just gonna move to a small town and become a witch and worship Satan. And it works out brilliantly for her.
Oh my God, I need to read these immediately. I would like to ask as well about, and I need to tread carefully here, because like I said, I don't want to give any spoilers, and I hope you're okay with me mentioning this. But
Sure.
there is I don't know if revelation is the right word, that Fern has at the end of the book. I should say Fern is your protagonist. And she has this sort of revelation when she's coming away from the maternity home, and she's in the car with her dad, and he's trying to make conversation, and she's thinking about the people that have put her in this place. And she comes to this kind of realization that actually she doesn't believe that they're evil, which she previously thought. She believes that they're acting out of fear, and that it's actually that they're afraid rather than evil. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of thought for her to have, and really mature for everything that she's kind of experienced. The fact that she would go, I'm not going to punish them or think about them in a way that punishes them. I'm going to try and, see it from their perspective. Why do you think, or where do you think that fear comes from?
Okay. So I think it's so many people, I mean, myself included, are terrified of childbirth and pregnancy. And I think a lot of women approach it with trepidation, which is totally reasonable. It's such a singular experience, but I also feel like there's a lot of around it. Like, think of how many times, like, you show a picture of like a newborn, and it's got vernix on it, and its skull maybe is a little off shape, and it's kind of bright red. And half the people say, oh, cute. And half the people go, ew, ick. And I'm one of those people. Like, friends would be like, oh, do you want to feel the baby kick? And I'd be like, hell no. I mean, up until I wrote this book, I was terrified of childbirth and labor, because it's also one of those things that's so positioned as this extremely gory, horrific experience. And so I think there's all this fear that surrounds it. And I think often that drowns out the other part of it. And I think there's a cultural fear of it. And there's a fear of the power of it. There's a fear of the grotesqueness of it. There's a fear of how it changes your body. I think that a lot of people have. And it's interesting. A woman she's a gynecologist, but she was talking to me about her OB rotation back in the 90s when she was in training. And she was doing obstetrics. And she said, and this is someone I know very, very well. I've known her for a long part of my life. And she's a very sort of cynical, very hard-edged kind of woman, a doctor who was all too willing to share with me the more horrible aspects of all of this. And she said to me at one point, and she's like, I've been in the room for, she said, I've been in the room for about 90 births.
Wow.
And I thought she was going to tell me something horrible. And she said it every time, it's a goddamn miracle.
Hmm.
And and she didn't mean it like it was a miracle, like I'm amazed they survived. I mean, she meant it like there is a miraculous element to it that's
Hmm.
very hard to put your finger on.
Yeah.
There's one person, there's two. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
something happens in that room that's really powerful. And I think it scares people. It scared me, I think
Hmm.
it scares a lot of people. So I think that's a lot of where this comes from. It's
Yeah.
fear. You know,
Yeah.
girls being expelled from school when they're pregnant. They don't want them to contaminate the other girls. There was a huge fear in the 1970s that if sex education about pregnancy was too explicit, women would be scared and never want to have a baby. It's this thing that we're just terrified of it. And I kind of feel like, that's what horror deals with, right?
Yeah, for
Things we're
sure.
scared of.
Yeah. I just think it's mind blowing as well that there's such a fear around it, considering, it's how we're all made.
I
So
mean, it
surely
is
the
something we all have in common.
Yeah, exactly. And it should be something that's kind of that we're grateful for and that we kind of honor these women for honor women for doing that and
Yeah.
for going through that. But it just seems to be the kind of opposite and it's, there's so much shame around it and it's still so taboo to kind of speak about it in great detail, which yeah, it just blows my mind. But
Yeah.
sorry, go.
It's no, I was just going to say, I mean, this is going to sound a little weird, but I mean, I think even something as purely the power of a pregnant woman and
Hmm.
her body, it really changes the dynamic of any room she
Yeah.
enters. Some people move closer, some move further away. I know lots of pregnant women who like hate the liberties people take. Oh,
Mm,
they touch her belly, and that kind of thing. But I think there are other people who shy away from it and sort of
yeah.
regard them with fear. So it's a really basic thing that I don't
Hmm.
think gets talked about enough.
No, for sure. I think that your book is amazing, and I really
Oh,
want
thank you.
people.
That's really nice of you.
I really want people to read this. It is out. This episode will be out on the 15th of January, and your book is out tomorrow in the UK when this episode lands, I believe. Is that correct?
That is, yes, the 16th.
Amazing. And is it out in the US on the same day?
2 days earlier. In the US, everything comes out on Tuesday, and I think UK it's Thursday.
Right. Okay.
So here it's the 14th. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so when this episode lands, it will be available in the US and it will be available in the UK tomorrow. Go grab yourselves a copy. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes. But I really, really love this book and I can't wait to hear what everyone thinks about it. Before I let you go, Grady, I do have to finish off by asking for a recommendation. So, is there any
Oh,
books, TV, films, or anything that you would like to recommend?
oh yeah. I mean, listen, all I do is I feel like try to make people read stuff. Um, so I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think of something to recommend that's recent. Well, I mean, Lolly Willows, which we just talked about.
Hmm.
Oh, and in terms of a movie, so I sort of put off watching I Saw the TV Glow. It's a horror movie. It's from last year. It's by a trans director named James Schoenbaum.
Hmm.
And I kind of put off watching it. I just was like, this isn't gonna vibe with me. It's not my thing. And I caught it on an airplane recently, which is probably the worst environment to watch anything. And it really blew me away. It
Oh
really
wow.
was. I mean, the movie is kind of to some extent about these kids who in high school are obsessed with this TV show that's kind of like a X-Files or a Buffy, and how that informs their life. But I feel like there's this darker, sadder element to it of this feeling that you're not living the right life, which I think is not just a trans concern. I think everyone sometimes, if only I'd said yes to this, if only I'd
Yeah.
said no to that, if only I'd done X instead of Y, I'd be such a different person. And I mean, there's a great Henry James story called The Jolly Corner, which is about the same thing, a guy meeting himself who's had the life he feels like he should have had. And I think there's this deep, horrific well of unconsolable sadness there that
Hmm.
I'm in the wrong life. I'm in the wrong timeline. And it's a movie that really captures that. And I'd never seen anyone grab onto it quite so well. So I
Mm.
saw the TV Glow really did blow me away.
That sounds amazing. I'm going to have to add that to my list. You've given me so many good recommendations throughout this episode, so thank you so much.
No, no,
Um,
no. I'm going for Foster as soon as I'm finding my copy
oh,
as soon as
you'll
we're
have
off.
to let me know what you think. Um, Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, so thank you.
Oh, dude, thank you. I love talking with people about books.
Of course, it's the best. Um, but I must ask you as well, for our listeners' benefit, they can, of
Oh,
course, grab your books, but is there any way that they can find you online, on social media?
yeah. If you just go to GradyHendrix.com, it's got the links to a podcast I do and all my social
Amazing.
media stuff. It's all in one place. Podcasting's hard. Did you know that?
Yeah, I did.
I just am learning that. And everyone who does podcasts is like, really? Is that your big
Yeah.
takeaway? Um, but yeah, so
No, it's so real.
GradyHendrix.com. Yeah, exactly.
I will have to check out your podcast. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. And
No, thanks for having me.
thank you for your wonderful book as well. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. As I said, go buy the book, go give Grady a follow, and you can give us a follow at a pair of bookends pod on Instagram and at a pair of bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And you can also go support us via Patreon. All of our links will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Bye, y'all.